let's start. So, why are we talking about the testing pyramid today? Because what we see in our teams is that testing pyramid is something which is understood but often not applied. And we believe there are a lot of challenges in the sense of biases and excuses often between the teams. But we believe that the testing pyramid is very important to reduce this thinking in silos between test and dev teams. And that's the reason we want to introduce it today, and hopefully we give you some arguments in your teams, maybe to apply those. So we have developed a showcase. It's an application. And we are going to start with a situation which we very often confronted. This is the application, and this is not just the application, this is the application in a test runner called Cypress. So I'm going to start the UI tests. Here we go. You see on the left the tests, you see the execution. Of course, this can be faster, but each run here, again and again, needs a lot of time. It's an application about the car insurance appliance, and you're going to create some car insurances. And you see it's running, executing. Now we have 30 seconds. And if I would execute all the tests, we would need 3 minutes. Let's look at the starting point. So there are 22 automated tests, and that's not a lot. And those 22 automated tests are testing the business logic of an application, which is much more complicated than just these 22 tests. And it needs now 3 minutes. That doesn't look a lot, but if you scale it up, as we will see afterwards, this is a lot of time. And now I'm going to hand over.
Exactly. So, as Roland already explained, we created a very small application to just show how easily the tests can become a problem. Even when we start to implement only a couple of tests, it will expand to be a couple of minutes within the first couple of sprints. So if we have a look at our application, we did a really good job in our front end, as you can see. There are only a couple of input fields that we need for the backend to calculate our car insurance premium. And for this to be calculated, there are the contract details, our personal details that we need to enter. And in our last step of these 4 steps of the front end, we are going to call our backend, and the calculation of the 2 different values is going to be shown on our site. So we have these 2 parameters. We are going to calculate our taxes, and we are going to calculate our premium for our car insurance. So this is very basic. And if you look at our business logic, you can see how basic it is. For each of those 2 calculations, we only have 3 different criteria to calculate it. So we only take a couple of things in consideration, and then we are just going to show you how this can escalate. And we were also thinking about, okay, which kind of tests do we need for this tiny application, because there are only a couple of classes, and we were taking 2 different metrics in consideration. So maybe for the people who have a testing background, those 2 metrics will tell you something. So we have the tests that we do by classification, or we are looking at all the edge cases for the calculation that we can find. And on the left side, it looks very neat. So we only have a couple of different test cases. And in the end, if we would test everything that we could, there would be 16 to 36 test cases, which is basically fine. So this is something that we can accomplish. But on the other side, we do have this tiny problem with our bonus-malus levels. So there are 18 different levels, and if we put this in this huge estimation of our edge cases, this would lead us to about 430 test cases for our really tiny application. So you can see if you do take it seriously and want to test everything, it will become a problem in a very short time.
To introduce the testing pyramid, we also have to look at our architecture. Right? And what we have already seen is there are 4 pages, 3 pages. You have values to be entered by the user. In the back end, so these architectures build up, it's calling them services, REST services. There are 3 REST services. Finally, there was 2 posts for the calculation. And there's internally also some kind of code, some calculators, which calculates the value. And there's something which reads some data, the coverage, the types of insurance, by the way, you want us to select that user. These calculations, this is just a business logic, right? We mentioned before, we have these 3 different types of parameter on this side, and these 3 different types of parameter on this side. Now, what have we done with these 22 test cases? We started testing exactly this test case. So we start here, automate the whole procedure, the whole pass, and then we just passing one value, another value, here a value, and just another value. That seems good, right? Doing the same again. Oh, just changed this value. This is one more test case for testing the whole business logic. And once the next one. So we're running the whole pass with our UI tests all the time, repeating and repeating. For me, this is a violation of a dry concept. Don't repeat yourself. Yeah? We're repeating the whole stuff again and again. And if we are going to use UI tests for testing our business logic. And there are some consequences. We will have a look at that next. First of all, we're going to do some refactoring. And this is explained by Katrin again.
Exactly, so we wanted to do it live, but I think with our technical side, we are going to show it on this video screen. So this is our application, and now you will see all of our tests that we created in our end-to-end module. I'm sorry if it's a little bit small, but I think it's just for the showcasing of how many front-end tests are in our front-end module, only to test the simple basic logic. And it's scrolling down and down, and you can even see that the most parts are even kept the same. So there's only one tiny thing changing in these front-end tests. So what we decided was we are going to go to our backend service, and there we are going to create a different kind of test called the API tests. So with these API tests, we now can only test the logic that is coming on the API itself. So we are creating like parameterized tests. You can see we can put very much information in a very tiny space. We now have good method names in our classes. We know what we are going to test inside of it, and we have a very nice framework how we can test it. These refactorings actually took a couple of hours, because what happened, on the one side we had the Cypress tests, and on the other side we are now in a Java module testing with a different framework. So this break of these 2 technologies is something that is going not very easily to be refactored. So you need to read through every single of these end-to-end tests and consider, okay, why do I need to refactor it, and how do I refactor it in the first place? So this step is essential, but it's not to be underestimated as well. And now we can actually see for the first time not only our ice cream cone that we have been talking about, but now we refactored our end-to-end tests, and now we have this called diamond layer that we are now in. You can see we left 3 end-to-end tests because we were actually thinking about, okay, what do we need to test through our end-to-end tests? And we decided, okay, we need one happy path where everything is going great, so I know that the requirements are tested as well. And 2 times we tested is if everything is cleared correctly, and also like more of the edge cases. And the rest of our tests could easily be refactored into the API layer. And we even added more because it was just so easily done. But as you can imagine, because our talk is also called We Are Refactoring to the Pyramid, we didn't leave it in the diamond level. Now we went on the lowest level to our unit test level. Because again, if you think about it, why do we test all of our 49 tests through our API? There is not a real reason for it, because if I want to test my API, I'm going to test the API, but not every logical scenario. So, because we already structured our API tests in a very well way, it was really simple to go back and actually create a second module for our logical tests in our unit test base and just refactor it on to the place where it should be. So what I did here is just going back to my integration test, copy everything that was in it, and move it to another kind of test, which was now called the premium service test. And because we had it already structured in that way, we could go back and only change the calling of the service. So I'm gonna do, on the lowest part, I have this method called service, and now I do not go through the API, but I call the real premium service in this case. So I'm directly going to, that was GitHub Copilot suggestion, I'm going directly to the source that I wanted to test. And I could do the same thing with also the second service, the text service. I'm just going to go in and copy everything that is in there and just change in the background what I want to change. And again, we need to ask ourselves, okay, and what is legitimate to stay in our API layer now? So what are the real kind of API tests that I want to keep? And again, I think we figured out that there are 3 tests that are absolutely necessary, and the other ones we could completely remove from our application. I also executed the tests, everything was green, and we had a major improvement of our timings that we now could see how much we improved by these small refactorings. So this is our final distribution. We have a very nice kind of pyramids. We have the few end-to-end tests in the top that really are basically going through the whole application. We have a couple of API tests that we felt were absolutely necessary, that we are going to have a valid contract. And then we have the logic test on our unit test level. How did this help us with our test duration? In the beginning, I was saying if we would do every single test that we can imagine, there were like about 460 tests. So we calculated how this would look like, and this would be about 6 seconds because the end-to-end tests are very slow. And for this tiny application, we would need about 15 minutes for one execution. If I'm a software developer and I change something, I'm definitely not going to execute every time after my refactorings all of my tests. I wouldn't do it if it takes so long. After our first refactoring to our API layer, we had a major improvement. So we now have an average time per test of about 1 second, which makes a reduction of our time of about 81%. And now we still have about 10 minutes of our test execution time that we want to reduce even further. And you can see in our last and final round with 468 unit tests, we could reduce the time to 30 seconds. And again, a reduction of about 95%. And we are testing absolutely the same thing in each of all the test cases. So there's no difference of coverage or anything else. And this is the huge amount of 468 tests.
The pyramid is our best choice.
It's the best choice.
Yeah. So the final pyramid, and this is my concern is, so what should we test on each of these levels, right? And this depends really also on your application. So this showcase is of course built in the way that we can move it smoothly to these different layers. But what we see in our practice, this happens also in other applications. And so first of all, end-to-end tests, what have we done? There was finally one happy UI pass. What we didn't mention at the beginning, there were additional flows on the pages, so you could walk back to a previous page, change something, or there was a reset button. We didn't mention that. But after removing this huge amount of business logic tests on the UI level, our backbone was free to add these new tests. And we had even more coverage than before. And also, what's still missing is some kind of validation. Think about, well, adding my birthday on an insurance contract. There was no validation tests quite now. And this is just UI logic. Somebody who is underage should not enter a date, which is not possible, or a date in the future for a birthday. All these kind of validations has not been added now. But now we have time as a UI tester to add these tests, and they are valuable. On the API level, yeah, I mentioned there were 3 REST services, 3 endpoints. All of these endpoints has been tested now also, again. But now we also added some exceptions. If you have this kind of APIs, REST services, there are different kinds of parameters and you can tweak it somehow. Yeah? But all these kinds of tests, they figure out something which we call a contract. And this is also called contract testing. We want to have stable contracts on this level. Anybody who is going to use our services from outside should be aware that this is working correctly. And finally, on the latest level, we have the complete business logic. Right? In our example, we can cover this easily just on this level. And in summary, it's much more. It's much more than at the beginning. Yeah? So from the end-to-end test level, it's also the integration, putting all the parts together. The API test level, the contract, fulfilling for anybody else who's going to use our services, and the unit tests really focuses on the business logic. And we also can have a look at who is going to develop these tests. Usually, end-to-end tests are the responsibility mostly of test automation experts by a test team. Now we also have a distribution of the efforts, because unit tests are usually covered by developers. And let's have a final look at the comparison of these different types of distribution. Lead time, well, this is obvious, from 50 minutes to some seconds, half a minute. Yeah. Of course, the example is small, it's not complex, but if you look at our real applications, the complexity is much higher, so we have a lot more of tests necessary, and this even is much worse than in our example. Dealing with failures, something which is very important in my opinion. So if I'm using these UI tests and a test is failing, we have to consider that this error or this failure could be in any place of the whole architecture picture. In any of these places. Remember the whole picture? If I use unit tests, it's just in the lowest level of our architecture, of our code. So this is something pinpointing me to the place where the problem is. And if I have a business logic error, where does it occur? It occurs here, very fast. It has to occur also here and also here. If there's an UI error, just an error in the UI, it's just here. It should not occur here, it should not occur here. Yeah? So it's really pinpointing us. Where is the area which have to analyze to fix this failure, which is not available, this detail on the ice cream cone. Maintainability, the same arguments apply for maintainability of these tests, because we always have to consider the whole part in the end-to-end scenario, because this means if there is a change anywhere in my code, it's the high possibility to adapt these tests to. Business logic changes are usually not that often. So if I move the responsibility to the pyramid, to unit tests, I usually don't have to change a lot of tests because business logic is not often changed. APIs also stay much more stable. But the UI, so there's a story about that. We prepared this showcase last year, and in January we run it again, and suddenly all the tests on the UI level were failing. And we didn't have an idea, we didn't have a clue why, because we didn't change it. And then we came into this, during the discussion, our idea was, well, the year changes the point in time, which changes the available contract types, insurance types, the coverage. And just by changing the percentages in the database, our tests have been failing on the UI. So this is just an example of how complicated maintainability is if you consider always the whole system. And then you also have to adapt the whole amount of tests on the UI level, which is much more fragile. Refactoring, just want to mention here. So in the ice cream cone, we didn't have any refactoring. There were manual efforts from the UI or end-to-end pyramid style to the API test. The manual efforts appear then if you have a technological change, a tool change. We changed from Cypress to Java testing, from TypeScript to Java, even though, my personal opinion, our design in the UI test was not that worse. We applied some styles, some principles, also to the tests, so they should be maintainable. But even though, if you have a technological change, the manual effort is there. If you just change from from the diamond to the pyramid, as we have seen, and you stay in the same technological stack, it's quite easy often to move these tests smoothly to another layer. Implications on teams. So what I see, or what we see in our teams, and what we see in our practice and in our projects. The ice cream cone fosters the separation of test and development activities. And it's even worse. We have asynchronous activities between testers and devs. Test automation teams are often set up separately. They are often working in different iterations. After developers have finished their features, this becomes even worse, because then they start asking questions about the features of the stories and about the requirements at this point, which is, in my opinion, too late. And if they identify failures, they're also going to interrupt the development team in their current work, because they already start working on new features and new stories. And if this duration is even huger, it becomes even worse. The diamond, in my opinion, here we start collaboration. We had set up a project last year where the testers itself moved from an ice cream cone to the diamond. The service tests were implemented by the test team. And then they need to start a collaboration, they need to start a communication, because the protocols are already becoming technical, more and more technical. And then developers and testers need to collaborate, because testers need to understand what is in the mind of the tester, of the developer has been, right? And finally, in my opinion, the pyramid, this is really a shift left of all activities. We are going to distribute the effort of developing the test to the whole team, and we introduce quality aspects to the whole team. Because now also developer has more responsibility about the quality. I know there are some concerns, especially about the trust maybe still, but this is something you can arrange, in my opinion, if you introduce the discussion about the quality and what we need to test or what we want to achieve with our software in the refinement meetings. If they start talking about examples and then just decide in which level of these 3 areas we are going to implement these tests, this becomes a collaborative activity. If you like to connect, yeah, we are still here. Maybe we meet also on the conference the next hours. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, maybe we can talk now.
Still have time.
Please.
That's to the solution specifically the API layer. You also talked about shift left, and I was thinking you showed code in the API layer, and it was vertically sliced, so by feature of the API. How would you incorporate a tester in all of this? Specifically a tester that is not able to code, which you don't have to be. So how would TDD or even BDD come into this?
Good question, because I think Roland also mentioned that we did something similar last year, and in that case we did not only introduce BDD but also the framework of SpecFlow, which is this very simple way of, it's not writing code but it's writing your requirements, so you're basically telling in plain English what you want to achieve. And we had a very long workshop series with the testers who had no understanding of programming or having a coding experience before, and they were also able to get into this kind of language. So Gherkin is something that is very easily adapted, and we have seen them really also fostering the communication with the developers, because at some point they were really eager also to get to, okay, how is the code working? And then they started to look at their own code base for the first time, although it wasn't really actually their job to go through everything, but they now had some kind of understanding what was going on there, and they're still using SpecFlow and BDD and Gherkin in their day-to-day work. So this was a nice success story of really manual testers going into the code base and really seeing how they can work together also with the dev team.
So one thing that I'm really struggling with is front-end testing. And I've never met a front-end developer who was happy how we tested front-ends. So how do front-end unit tests and things like that also play into what you showed, and what's your kind of like guide to how to make your front-end stable?
Okay, so for let's say just for the part of how we the tools are testing our UIs, there are some practices, right? These are more technical practices, and these are more test automation practices, in my opinion. They are somewhere available. You also can introduce some kind of frameworks, but there are some best practices you should really apply. For example, how to identify the UI element and all that stuff. On the other side, I also help teams to write unit tests for the UI, and I really appreciate that. And it was always interesting for me that they didn't have the idea before to use, for example, TDD as a test-driven development with the UI logic. Because, as I mentioned before, the birthday is some kind of UI logic. And there is some kind of code in the UI also, which is just testing this check of dates. And why do we need a lot of UI-driven tests? Because this can be done also by unit tests on the UI code, in the UI code. And I really foster that. I try to help teams to understand the different levels of testing also in this part. And that's very important in my opinion. But this, again, speeds up time. And it's not just about speeding up, as Katrin mentioned. As a developer, developers don't want to wait that long. Right? It's not just the speeding up that we are going to become faster in the sense of, well, this is now faster. It's the response that everything is working fine. That's the important part. If it's just some, let's say a minute, even if it's just 2 minutes, it's not enough time for a coffee. I think we should add something that we need have more, that we have more time for a coffee break, right? Because curiously, this is as a coder, I'm a developer. I finish something and then I want to have the feedback because everything is fine, so everything is good, right? And sometimes you need a break, but you don't have a break for an hour anymore.
Oh.
Other questions? Oh.
When shifting from end-to-end tests to the unit tests, like you said, also the responsibility is shifting from, let's say, QA to development.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that all developers need to be QA experts so that we can ensure that the quality of the tests is fine compared to the end-to-end tests, which were written by, let's say, QA experts?
I would like to answer on that. I think it becomes a collaborative work together now, right? Because the expertise of the testers are still necessary. So, for example, this number of 468 tests, right? This is something which, this is not in the genius of the developers. So they need support. And it's not just, I think that the shift is more in the responsibility who is going to implement the tests. But the decision which tests we need is something we need to do together. And that's for me the real shift. That's for me the real shift. So on the one side, be a craftsman to implement the tests, but on the other side, there's the expertise, what do we need? And still there should be the discussion, which of these quality aspects needs to be implemented where. So this, it's not only that easy as it looks like here, because the showcase is of course adapted to it, but in real life it's quite more complicated. And in my opinion, behavior-driven development is a way where you can start discussion about the quality and the examples you need to test very early in your refinement. And this works quite well, as we have seen in our project last year. Answers this the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other question? Oh, one more. The last one. Oh, we have time. We have been very fast, great. This was the purpose of our talk, that we have time for discussions, right?
Again, about the middle layer, the API layer. I mean, this is a very specific thing. A REST API, it already provides its own technical use cases for us, so it's a nice thing to have as a test layer. Whereas when I have a cloud class with 20,000 methods or so, I would need to find the proper use cases there. But more on the point, current microservice architectures, or some people even use nano services, where one if is a service. How would I go ahead and test this when I only have the E2E test, because people think there is no other way than to try and error test the whole system? How do I test those use cases?
For microservices, I think the approach fits perfect, right? Because each microservices will have some kind of services. There might be different technologies. I know that from other projects. For example, if you have asynchronous communication between the microservices, which makes it much harder than having REST services which are synchronous. But from my opinion, still each microservice has some kind of contract, depending on the technology you're talking about. So, but even though I can apply it to on this level of technological architecture.
Okay,
very well, in my
I
opinion.
completely clear maybe, because in my opinion testing a microservice is basically a unit test. They are so small, there's no way to have a bigger picture. I'm testing, okay, when I write into the database, it's in the database, so that's a unit test. That's not when the customer logs in, the customer will have a login or something like that. So there's a middle layer to be found here. And how would I go ahead and do this in a microservice architecture?
I mean, if
one microservice in itself is just one functionality, very, very small.
Okay.
If they're so small, I think that the borders are really squishy on what is an API test and what is a unit test. You're right, because we could actually go and say, again, we do one happy path, so we know that the REST API is working and we can access it from outside. And we had 2 or 3 additional other tests where we tested if the right exceptions were thrown when we did put the wrong input in. So we defined that these are our necessary tests that we needed to have from the API, and then we could go back to our logic and test the logic inside. If there are only like 2 or 3 lines of code, maybe the combination of API and unit test makes sense, because otherwise you would again duplicate only the tests that you already have, and then the maintenance of always having to edit both of those kind of tests wouldn't really make sense. So I would, in this case, if it's so small, maybe only go to the diamond level and leave out the furthest on top, on the layer down.
Maybe the huge difference is also that we are going to test with an API level is we are deploying already some server, and we are having some kind of infrastructure code also being tested. Right? And also this deployment and this configuration is tested. On the unit test level, we don't do that. And maybe this helps you to separate these different kind of tests. This is usually what helps me. And also it depends on your inside software design. So you can, of course, I believe that some kind of software design, so I'm not believing, I'm sure about that, helps us to test our units, our smallest units, much even easier than other designs.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Maybe one question about how to keep track with the pyramid. Yeah, do you recommend any coverages, or what would you recommend?
I was waiting for the coverage question. So this is just some personal thing for me. I do not always aim for 100% coverage in code, because at some point there are methods or classes that do not really make sense to unit test because they do not have their own logic. So testing setters and getters just for the sake of testing them is something I personally wouldn't do, just to improve my coverage. In general, in distributing on the layers, I think it's hard to say okay, if I test the end-to-end throughout, I need to have a specific number. I wouldn't know if there is something out there. I think a good guidance is in your backend, so on your unit test base, maybe to have some kind of 80% or something in this direction, but there is no real coverage law that you need to have on each layer. I'm not sure if Roland agrees.
Oh yeah, the coverage is a funny discussion. So there's a coverage on the unit test level. For me, coverage is, so the question is more about how can I take care that the coverage is enough the whole application, if I understood the question. So it's not just about the unit
All
test.
of this, and also very often it's an initiative that you switch from IS code to pyramid, and after 2 years you're back in IS code. And of course you don't want to have this. So kind of you need to have a track that the team still behaves as we wanted to have it. And it's more about this.
Okay, it's more about the process or the progress of how can we keep this track.
Usually you would have different test runners in your CI/CD. Executing unit test is different from integration test or UI test with
Of
a
course.
full running system. And so you know, okay, 3,000 here, 5,000 there, and 20 there.
Of course, you have some metrics if you include them in your CI/CD pipeline, and of course you should do that, right? What we have seen here with Cypress, this is also can be executed headless, which we would recommend on that side. Of course, you can trigger or measure the amount of tests and the distribution of tests. This is something you can consider. I think it should be part of a test strategy. This is what we followed up last year in our project, setting up a test strategy and repeating this strategy again and again. So it becomes a common sense that we have this mind of distributing our tests in that way. And on the other side, it needs some experts who are going to challenge the system of quality all the time, in my opinion. Who takes care about that. And do we, as any other strategy, are we still on the right path, or are we following this path, or have we left it? And then we need to react on that. And I think also the systems will give you feedback. So for example, if the number of end-to-end tests increases, well, your tests will become slow. Your CI/CD pipeline will become slower and slower. And then you will have the point in time where you're going to discuss about that, what happened in the past. So I strongly believe that we need to monitor and see what happens, are there any deviations, and then change.
Right.
Then, thank you.
Thank you.
We're open for discussions. We're still on the conference, so myself, Katrin is to leave. Thank you very much for watching.